Today's presentation is about election integrity, and I'm just going to be honest, it's not the most uplifting of presentations. However, I think, we all know how high the stakes are in this election, and we know that, we're already seeing concerning things about what will happen, particularly, I think, as the vice president's numbers continue to go up, the concerns we have about what might happen from the administration, from the president, to try to undermine the integrity of the election. We spent a lot of time on our calls, and I know a lot of people have been spending time thinking about voter suppression and the vote by mail aspects, but Matt will cover some of that, but also has done a really fascinating and important job of documenting all the things that can happen between now and actually Inauguration Day. So he'll walk us through that, and hopefully, I was just saying to him, will give us a little bit of hope that maybe there's some things that with this knowledge we can be prepared for and we can do about it. So I'm going to turn over to Matt. When Matt is finished with his presentation, we will take Q&A, and you can just use the Q&A button on Zoom to let me know if you'd like to ask a question, and we'll moderate those post-presentation. So with Matt, let me turn it over to you.
Debbie, thank you so much. And as you noted, I am a huge and lifelong, or the Life of New Deal long fan of this organization, and we've featured many of your leaders at our events. I'm going to attempt to share my screen, something I am bad at, but hopefully I think you should be seeing the right thing at the moment. So as Debbie's partner in crime at the New Deal likes to say, Helen always says, the future is bright, and I think that that is true in the long term. What I am fearing, and what you'll see we all have to worry about, is that in the near term, things could get a little rocky. If you listened carefully to Trump's debate, it becomes pretty clear that they're beginning to give up on the proposition that they can swing voters to their cause. They know they have their base of 42, 43%, but it did not appear to me, at least, that he was trying to get new people to vote for him. And it may be that his theory of the case is that the way he remains in office isn't by getting more people to vote, it's by ensuring that all the votes are not counted, or that all the people who want to vote don't. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that today. As Debbie said, it's not particularly uplifting, but there is some hopefulness to be found. So we all know, let's see what's happening here. There we go. Don't allow rigged elections, tweeted the President of the United States on May 1st. This was not unusual. By late July, Trump had made this comment 91 times this year, and that was in July. The pace of his attacks on the integrity of the vote have increased in the months since then. And look, he's left no doubt. He's going to do everything he possibly can to muddy the electoral waters. He's going to lie, cheat, and try to steal the election, and some of his Republican allies will help. So the question is, how are we going to stop him? How do we ensure that Trump is unable to snatch this election away by manipulating the outcome? And the answer starts with understanding Trump's war plan. Some of it, like voter suppression, is depressingly familiar. Other parts, like hijacking the Electoral College, would be pretty new. To make sure you have the complete picture, I'm going to walk through the Trump plan to cheat at various phases of the process and give you a sense of how Democrats and others are preparing to fight back to save our democracy. So his plan will roll out over 4 phases. The first is the one we're in now, where he is attempting to suppress the vote. The second is on election day itself, where he will attack the systems that we use to vote. The third is after the election, and the fourth comes in January when Congress meets to formalize the election of a new president. I'm going to move through the first 2 sections rather quickly. This has become fairly well-plowed ground. So the first is voter suppression. This is the period between now and November 3rd in which Trump's team is focused mainly on preventing people from voting. Voter suppression is depressingly enough as old as the nation itself. And while in 2020, no one is going to be forced to count the number of jelly beans in a jar like in the Jim Crow South, the Republicans do have some new tricks up their sleeve. The first is simply limiting who can vote by tossing people off the voter rolls. They probably won the Georgia governor's race in 2018 doing this, and then the Secretary of State who was running for governor purged 753,000 voters off the rolls, at least half of whom were determined to have been thrown off improperly. The second, of course, is the use of foreign misinformation. Some of it's domestic, some of it's Russian and other places. And this is much more nasty and pernicious than it was even last time. And the third is a relatively novel idea, which is to cripple the post office. Starving and crippling the post office. No one has thought of that before, so you have to give Trump credit for that, but he is denying them funds, and he put in a postmaster general who's trying to slow the mail down. Okay, so that brings us to November 3rd, Election Day, and the attack on the voting infrastructure itself. They have a variety of new plans to limit or damage the tools that people use to vote. The first is simply to shut down polling places. Many of these polling places, of course, will be lost to COVID, but a lot more will be lost to Republicans. The Supreme Court weakened the law, of course, in 2013, and since then, red states in the South have shut down more than 1,700 polling places. That number was gathered, by the way, before COVID started. And more are closing every day. You're seeing outrageous things like the shutting of all polling places on large college campuses and that kind of thing. The second is scaring away voters. In 2018, there was a decades-long consent decree between the Republican Party and the Justice Department that expired. That had been intended to keep them from intimidating voters at the polls, which they'd done before that. So now Republicans are spending millions to deploy 50,000 poll watchers, not poll workers, poll watchers. And they're actively recruiting off-duty soldiers and cops to intimidate voters in cities, and in particular in communities of color, by threatening them with arrest or fines for what they will call voting improperly. So what are Democrats doing to respond to all of this nonsense between now and the end of Election Day? Well, first, they're lawyering up. They have the top political attorney for the DNC and State Democratic Party is this gentleman, Mark Elias. He and his team are waging legal battles in more than 30 states, pushing back against voter suppression of all types. The Biden campaign now has 2 former solicitors general of the United States and hundreds of lawyers involved, either as staff or volunteers. And they have Eric Holder, who is serving as a liaison to the groups like Stacey Abrams and Fair Fight. The Brennan Center and a variety of other groups are engaged in litigation and advocacy and voter education. And finally, they're using their political power. This is the Postmaster General, who the House Democrats called in August to try to bring him to heel, and to some extent that worked, but not entirely. Okay, so that brings us through election night, and what comes next in the Trump war plan, and this is where things get really hairy. Because if he can't suppress the vote, he is going to try to stop the count, and we have been here before. If you remember these charming folks, they were the Brooks Brothers riot. They were a group of khaki-clad, shouting Republicans who invaded the Miami-Dade election office in 2000, trying to stop the recount. Remember, we had counted the votes in Florida in 2000. That was the recount. And these guys are going to look pretty tame compared to what may be coming this November. This time, the Republicans' demand to stop the count will not be based on hanging chads. It will be based on the blue shift. So this is a well-established phenomenon. Democrats usually improve their vote totals when the counting goes beyond election night, kind of into overtime. So for example, in 2016, Trump was leading Clinton in Pennsylvania, but while he ended up winning the state, his lead shrank by 23,000 votes between election night and when they finally certified the election in Pennsylvania. And that was not a fluke, because while Democrats had previously won the state, their lead had increased by around 22 or 23,000 votes each cycle. That happens every year. And this is true almost everywhere. The reasons are somewhat vague and they vary. Democrats in cities always cast more provisional and absentee ballots than in Republican counties, and those take longer to count, so that's why this blue shift tends to happen. In 2018, the blue shift was on in Florida when Trump tweeted this, quote, "The Florida election should be called for Rick Scott and Ron DeSantis, in that large numbers of new ballots showed up out of nowhere," which by the way meant showed up in the mail, "and many ballots are missing or forged," which was a lie. An honest vote count is no longer possible. Ballots massively infected must go with election night, exclamation point. This year, the blue shift is going to be massive because many more Democrats than Republicans plan to vote by mail. And in 12 states, including Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, state law prohibits the counting of mail-in ballots before Election Day. Those ballots take a long time to count. They have to be remedied, which means they might be crumpled and have to be flattened, or they might be missing a signature, and someone has to go out to ensure that that voter had intended to vote that way. So even in an election that Biden ultimately wins, the election night tally could easily favor Trump. Some analysts are calling that the red mirage. And that means Trump will spend every single day from November 4th on claiming that this blue shift is a fraud and that the election is being stolen. So his main line of attack will come between Election Day and December 8th. And this is where things get complicated, so bear with me. December 8th is the date set by federal law by which state officials must certify that the results of those elections for one candidate or the other in order to immunize their slate of electors from challenge when it gets to Congress under the so-called safe harbor provision of the Electoral Count Act of 1887. Now, Congress passed that law after the debacle of the Hayes-Tilden election. Then many states, this was of course post-Civil War, many states were sending two different slates of electors to Congress, and the resulting compromise was a total fiasco. It actually led to the end of Reconstruction and another 100 years of horror and Jim Crow. So it was not a good compromise in 1876, and it was just a debacle. So Congress passed this law that was designed to prevent these kinds of things happening in the future. And the safe harbor deadline is the reason that the US Supreme Court ruled on the day that it did in Bush versus Gore in 2000. And it was one of the reasons that Gore immediately conceded the race, because he knew that since the Florida certification was going to happen after Bush versus Gore came down on that day, on that safe harbor day, so within the safe harbor deadline, it was going to be impossible for him to challenge the Republican electors from Florida when they were presented before Congress. And so he even had to overrule fellow Democrats who tried to object to that when that happened, when they did the vote count. He presided as vice president. So anyway, December 8th, Safe Harbor Day, that is the date that Trump is playing for time to reach. If the blue shift is happening, and he's unlikely to ultimately win the popular vote, he will try to stop or slow the count long enough so that he is still technically ahead on December 8th. And the idea would be for him best to get his own electors certified before December 8th, or at the very least prevent Biden from getting his electors certified by then. And that's why he will try to throw a wrench in the works. So here's how it will work. First, he could try to get the courts to step in. He has already indicated that he is going to do this, as this quote makes clear. Now, if Trump gets a court to agree to stop the count, that would certainly bolster his case that he had won the popular vote by virtue of his election night lead, which, again, a mirage, but that's what the argument would be. Now, that would be a stunning, preposterous thing for a court to do, but it is possible that that could happen. If the court if the court orders a governor to certify a popular vote victory for Trump based on this, that could end the process for that state and give Trump the electoral votes. If a court declines to do that, he could turn to state legislatures for help. In all 6 of the top swing states, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Arizona, and Florida, and even in the next 4 most likely swing states, Ohio, Georgia, Texas, and Iowa, both chambers of the state legislature are controlled by Republicans. And under the Constitution, those of you who are state legislators know this, electors are appointed, quote, in such manner as the legislature thereof may direct. So presumably, they could step in, stop the count, and essentially make the appointment of electors themselves, these electoral bodies. This has never happened. It is almost certainly a violation of the 14th Amendment. But here is what some scholars think the legislatures could do. First, they would do what Trump is doing, call the blue shift a fraud. They would claim the election night tally, therefore, is controlling. And on or before the 8th, they would pass a bill whereby they would certify the Trump electors. Now, in the states, the swing states that have Republican governors, like Arizona and Florida, it is possible, we don't know for sure, but it's possible that the governor could agree with this legislative gambit and actually sign the certification and then send that on to Congress. In states that have a Democratic governor, like Michigan, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, the governor would almost certainly refuse to certify this slate because it would disenfranchise the voters of that state. It would basically ignore the election in that state. And at the end of the count, the state legislature would send its slate and the governor would send their slate to Congress. And they would end up with two dueling slates of electors arriving in Congress. So you have to be wondering, could they do this? Would a court allow a legislature to take back a power that they have already given to voters? After all, every state has a law saying we will appoint our electors based on the outcome of the popular vote in our state. So it would violate their own state law that existed on election day. They could pass a bill, presumably to change that state law, but it would be an ex post facto maneuver, and it would seem to take away a democratic right that had been granted. And that seems like a clear violation of the 14th Amendment and federal law. So could they take it back? We don't know. This is untrod ground. But the Electoral College Act says legislatures can step in if there is, quote, a failed election. So Republicans will argue that the fraud that Trump is talking about has made it a failed election. And that will be nonsense, but that's what they will say. But even if they could do this, would they? Would a state legislature stop the counting of votes and substitute their own judgment for that of the voters of their state? And would any governor of either party go along? Maybe not. It is a big and crazy thing to do, but we've learned in the Trump era that such things are possible. So if this kind of thing happens, or if a court steps in, we move on to Congress. And here's where we get to Trump's fourth plan, the one that he would take in January. If a disputed slate from slate of electors comes to Congress, he is going to try to get Mike Pence and Republicans in Congress to win the day for him. Now remember, the new Congress is sworn in on January 3rd, and they meet to open the electoral votes on January 6th. So this is the new Congress, not the lame duck Congress. Mike Pence presides as the vice president. And usually this is a totally pro forma thing that no one pays any attention to because we know what the outcome is already. We don't know how they would resolve any disputes because there hasn't been one since 1876. But what we do know is that Trump would try to get Pence and the Republicans to choose the electors for him. Now, if a disputed slate of electors came from a state with a Republican governor who had signed the legislature's slate, Pence and the Republicans would argue that it counts since the governor certified it, especially if it happened on or before December 8. If it was certified after that date, the Democrats would argue that it's fraudulent since it doesn't reflect the actual popular vote and it's not within the safe harbor. If two disputed slates of electors come from a state with a Democratic governor, Pence would say the legislature's pick prevails because of the legislature's power under Article 2, and Democrats would say that the governor's certification matters, so the Biden slate should prevail. Either way, it's a mess. There's no clear process under the act for resolving these disputes. And for the states with Democratic governors, Trump's best bet might be for Pence to argue that both Trump and Biden slates from that state, the two competing slates, should just be thrown out. Now, why could this benefit Trump? Because tossing those electoral votes might not change the requirement that one candidate get to 270 electoral votes to win. I say might because the rules for calculating that denominator are uncertain. They've never really been litigated. But if 270 is the margin they got to get to, and if neither of the candidates gets to 270, which could definitely happen if a big state like Pennsylvania had its electoral votes thrown out, then the House decides. Now that might sound good for Democrats because Democrats have a large majority in the House, but it's not, because under this rule, they vote by delegation. That means every state gets one vote. 54 members of Congress in California get one vote, and one member of Congress from Montana gets one vote, that are equal. So at the moment, Republicans control 26 delegations in the House, Democrats control 23, one of them is tied. Now that could change. Assuming Democrats don't suffer some dramatic losses in House races, delegation majority control is going to depend on the outcome of some tightly contested House races in currently Republican districts. But Democrats would need to win at least one district in 4 of these states: Alaska, Florida, Montana, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. Flipping all 4 of those 5 is a long shot. If Biden isn't already just completely crushing it in the Electoral College, at which point this wouldn't matter. So if it's a tight presidential race, Trump is likely to prevail if the vote is thrown to the House. But it's more likely that the dispute would devolve into a completely novel partisan and legal battle, and no one knows how it would be resolved. The Electoral College Act has rules, but some of them are very unclear, and there is no guarantee that Congress would follow them because they don't have to. Those are rules established by Congress to govern itself. If the 2 sides can't agree, the Supreme Court might intervene like they did in 2000, but they might not. This is the classic political question that courts, including the Supreme Court, like to avoid. If there is still no result in this election by January 20th, the Presidential Succession Act suggests that the Speaker of the House would become the acting president. That is a real thing on January 20 at 12:01 p.m. At 12 p.m., the terms of Trump and Pence end. If they are not elected by vote of the House and the Electoral College, they are no longer in office, and she succeeds to the presidency, at least in an acting capacity. That would be, to put it mildly, a suboptimal outcome. So we need to buckle up. We know that the next 29 days are going to be very rough, and we could be in for a nasty few months after that. The Trump Republicans are likely to pull out all the stops if the election is close enough, whether they win or lose. But that doesn't mean, to Debbie's point, that you should feel helpless or hopeless. There's a lot of work being done. I've already noted what's happening with Democrats. There's also a large number of groups. Democracy Docket is the Elias group, but these others are, for the most part, nonpartisan, and they are doing some incredibly important and good work, and they are aligned very closely with the folks at the DNC who are doing election protection, not in a partisan way, but just to ensure that all the votes are counted. I will end with this story. I worked in the White House for Al Gore. In 2000, I was in Nashville on election night, and I was moping around in the headquarters of the campaign on the day after the election, completely stunned. Nobody could possibly have anticipated that it would end in a tie. And a senior staffer came up to me and said, "Could you go around and ask people if they're lawyers, because we're going to put a group of lawyers on a plane and send them to Florida." So we were not prepared to litigate a disputed election in 2000, but we are definitely prepared to do it this time. I think both legally and politically we will be ready. And my very strong expectation is that if Joe Biden doesn't win in a landslide, which he might, he will win at the end of the day regardless. So with that, I will stop sharing and would love to hear your comments or questions.
That was so fantastic, Matt. Thank you. I mean, as advertised, not the most uplifting news to hear, particularly when we've got so much going on. But I think really important for people to understand the process. I think a lot of us, even political junkies, didn't know some of the steps that were involved. So super helpful. As a personal point of privilege, I must note that apparently my birthday is Safe Harbor Day. So that's also really important for me to know what I will be asking for my birthday each year. let me just again remind everybody, I've got lots of questions, but let me remind everyone they can also use the Q&A box to ask Matt questions or make comments. Let us know if you're seeing something on the ground that he should be aware of. So questions or comments. But let me start with one while people are thinking, Matt. You mentioned this at the end, very end, like last sentence, but do you think that there is a margin either at the popular vote nationally or even like at the state by state level where you think it's just too big of a margin for some of these shenanigans to happen?
Yes, I think for basically three reasons. First, it would just be silly if Biden wins the popular vote by the kinds of margins we're seeing in recent polling. Even his own team may not back Trump in an effort to try to steal the election then. Second, we could win the election on election night because there are big states that count their absentee ballots early, which means their full vote is reported on election night, and there are states that Trump has to win, like Florida or Ohio. If Biden wins Florida or Ohio, the election is over. Not even the craziest partisan could argue otherwise, and none of this will matter. This is all assuming that we basically get down to the Hillary states plus Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, or some combination involving North Carolina, Arizona. And then the third thing is that states like Arizona, we learned a lot in 2018 when, as you may recall, Kyrsten Sinema was losing on election night because of the red mirage, and then ended up winning a week later by 50,000 votes after they counted all the ballots there. They have changed their process, so they're going to be faster in Arizona. But we also learned a lot about how to tally that. And our team did some math I don't understand to determine that if Joe Biden wins Arizona by 3 points or more, he is likely to be, in the end, ultimately, he's likely to be leading on election night, and that could help, squash this before it starts.
Yeah, and a lot of our elected officials, New Deal members or elected officials, we have a handful of secretaries of states. Are you, you didn't mention secretaries of states in any of this. You mentioned legislatures and governors. Are you seeing anything? We've had a couple programs with some of our secretaries of states who've given us a little bit of hope about a bipartisan nature of how secretaries of states have been handling this. Have you seen anything to the contrary, or is there a role that Republican secretaries of states could play in any of this?
For sure. Secretaries of State are vital. And one of the great things about the 2018 cycle and before is that we started to win those offices, and some of them became your leaders. And they are just incredibly important. They are second only to the governor as the most important person in the state as it relates to all of this. In states that have Democratic secretaries of state, they are both pushing back on voter suppression efforts that we're seeing now and are likely to see on election day as effectively as they possibly can, and they are going to be central players if this argument that the election is fraudulent is prosecuted in their states. So remember, what would have to happen, let's just take Pennsylvania, for example, is the Pennsylvania legislature, controlled by Republicans, would argue that the election had failed. That's what they have to argue under the Electoral College Act in order to step in themselves. And even if they do, we're hoping the courts wouldn't allow it. Let's pretend they can go forward. The Secretary of State of Pennsylvania or whatever state it is would certainly argue, no, the election has not failed. The absentee ballots are completely reliable and our system is very safe. And so that will be a very, very important argument for the secretaries of state to make. And I'll remind you of the central role that Katherine Harris played in Florida. She, as an ally of Bush, was nevertheless arguing that the vote count was accurate. And that is what secretaries of state will be arguing this time. You're muted, Debbie.
Sorry, I'm trying to save you some background noise when you're speaking. Thank you. When you put this presentation together, Matt, I know because we talked about it, there were a handful of things that hadn't happened yet, because in the 24-hour day we live in, when we live a year every 24 hours. So neither Justice Ginsburg had passed away when you started thinking about this, nor obviously all that has happened with the president being diagnosed with COVID. So I've got a couple questions for you on kind of the just intrigue of what happens in this maneuvering. So what if, for example, Mike Pence is acting president at the time of the election, if the president is somehow incapacitated by his diagnosis? What does that change anything you told us about if it gets to Congress and Mike Pence's role?
Not, well, a little bit. The role in the counting of the electoral votes on January 6th is really just more pro forma than it is anything else. It's the same as, the acting chair of the Senate every day is generally the most junior member of the majority party. So it's not really a vital role, it's more administrative. So I don't know who would perform that role. Perhaps it would be the secretary, the president pro tem of the Senate, I think would probably accede to that position. But it wouldn't change the way anything happened. What is clear is that if Trump were to die after the election, but prior to January 6th, the electoral votes are cast for the votes that voters cast are for the electors, and the electors are for a slate. And so Pence would replace Trump as the president-elect if they won. If Trump won the election and then died, Pence would be president-elect, and he would then select a vice president under the Constitution. But it almost certainly wouldn't change the administrative function of the counting of the electoral votes. It would certainly change the way the Republicans approach things, because Pence's style is somewhat different than Trump's, but who knows how that would work.
Right. And on the, actually, I'm getting a question here. If there's let me just read this one. I'm getting a couple comments just thanking you and saying, bemoaning where we find ourselves as a country, which we all second for sure. This question came in, if there's a tie in the House, state by state, isn't there a constitutional provision that lets the Senate elect the VP and the VP takes office? I think you kind of just generally answered that, but if you want to add anything else there.
Yeah, that's right. The Senate, if there's a tie, the Senate elects the vice president and the House elects the president. And those don't necessarily have to be the same party, which would be a very odd result for us in modern times, but wasn't obviously in the early part of the Republic. But if we take the Senate back, if the Democrats take the Senate back, it's the new Senate that would vote. Now, this gets even more complicated because there could be runoffs in Georgia and maybe Louisiana in January. So God knows what will happen in terms of that election. But that is really only in the event of a tie or some sort of deadlock that the court rules have to be, broken under these rules. Yeah.
Mind-blowing. Think about all the various scenarios with runoff elections.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. So back on my question about kind of these new parameters we find ourselves in, or these new circumstances. So you mentioned the court system, and that you said that it would go to federal court, not the Supreme Court necessarily. Presumably it would go to a federal court and then appealed up to the Supreme Court. Is that right?
Maybe not. Remember, the Florida case was litigated in the state courts, and it got to the state Supreme Court of Florida, and the Supreme Court, U.S. Supreme Court took it from there. What will matter is whether there's a federal case or controversy at issue, and the Democrats are sure to say that this would violate the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, and therefore it would be federal, and they might be able to remove the case from state court to federal if they want to. The problem is that Trump has named so many judges to the federal courts that depending on where this is, it may not be in their interest to have federal judges hear these cases. In any event, the likelihood is it ends up in the U.S. Supreme Court.
And so to that end, Matt, this is a little bit outside the scope of your presentation, but given where we are with, again, COVID in the Senate, and the Senate being, and we're all watching whether or not the Judiciary Committee is going to meet, do you see a scenario where he does not get the Supreme Court nominee through before Election Day?
Sure, it would probably involve some of those senators being so sick that they can't participate at all. I'm sure you saw the comment from one of them saying he would arrive in a moon suit if he had to. I mean, they're very determined to get this done, but it is conceivable that they can't get a quorum and they don't proceed. The really interesting thing at the hearings, presuming they happen, is My sense is Democrats are going to focus on three things: the Affordable Care Act, Roe, and this question: will Judge Barrett agree to recuse herself from this? Because the president has said out loud, it was on one of those slides, that he is going to use the federal courts to try to stop the count. He has already announced that. And he has said that he wants her on the court to resolve this controversy. So if any case for recusal has ever been like rock solid, it's this. Now, she probably won't recuse, but I think that's what Democrats will talk about.
Yeah, I think that's right. Another question coming in from our viewers here: is there anything that would prevent Trump from placing, armed folks at polling places on election day? You mentioned that a little bit earlier, but tell us more about that, what you're hearing.
Well, it depends on, the answer is not really. There are various laws governing the use of federal agents. You can't use active duty soldiers. The Posse Comitatus Act prevents that. You can't send the 82nd Airborne to polling places in North Carolina. But he can do what he did in the summer around the protests, which is to send armed federal agents into cities or counties at his discretion. And his authority is very broad when it comes to that. That would be a just spectacular violation of our most fundamental and cherished democratic principles. So would he get away with it? We don't know, but it would be so breathtaking that even Trump Republicans may not countenance that. Now, I say that advisedly because I've been wrong. Well, I would have been wrong had I predicted that on any other thing that they were willing to go along with, but boy, that would be super far over the line.
Yeah. Matt, let me end with a couple questions around kind of, back to what we can do about this. What is your advice to state and local leaders or other just, Democratic leaders around the country in terms of messaging, both leading up to the election, and then particularly if there is, which we assume there may be, a delay, as you talked about, in counting votes or in finding out the winner? What is your advice on how Democrats should be talking about this to their constituents who are presumably freaking out a little bit and already are?
Yeah, I think two things. One is blindingly obvious, which is vote early if you can, vote in person if you're able. It is just better to have in-person votes. And if you're in a state that doesn't count, there are 12 of them, that doesn't count until election day, really try to vote in person, even if that's early. That's number one. Number two is the principle that Democrats and NGOs engaged in democracy protection need to focus on relentlessly is we're going to count every single vote. We're not stopping this count until every vote is counted. And we can remind people that the 2000 election wasn't about counting all the votes, it was about recounting votes. So we have never had a candidate for president argue that we shouldn't count people's votes. That is un-American. And we are not doing that in whatever state, city, county I represent if I'm a New Deal leader. And if you're in the legislature in one of these swing states, begin working on, to the extent they exist, your moderate Republican colleagues, saying, are you really going to allow Donald Trump to destroy the central tenet of our democracy? Because that's what this is. The principle that we elect our leaders is the thing that has made this the greatest democracy in the world. And he is taking an axe to them. And you just cannot allow that to happen.
Yeah. Thank you, Matt, so much. I want to again just appreciate you walking us through that and get us thinking about what we can do. I want to thank you in general for your support and friendship and partnership over all these years. And then I want to remind everyone who's watching that we will have one more election-related event program prior to Election Day, which is next Tuesday at 2 p.m. Eastern. We'll be hearing from Joel Bennett, National Democratic pollster, who the Third Way works with quite a bit as well, to hear kind of where we are and what we can expect, as well as from some New Deal swing staters who will tell us what's happening on the ground. So hope you can all join us from that. So yeah, go ahead.
Can I say just one? I'm sorry, I forgot to mention. This presentation that I gave is available on our website. It's on our homepage, thirdway.org. You don't need a voiceover. It's written out there on the slide. So please share that widely.
We appreciate that, and we will do that. Thank you so much, Matt, and thanks to everyone who joined us. Appreciate
you.
it.